Hi, my name is Ann Morgan. I am a former member of Church of the Village, back when it was Met-Duane. I'm also a retired United Methodist pastor, just now finishing a part-time appointment in retirement. I was here, meaning at Church of the Village, in another incarnation, and was here through 4 different pastors. But most significantly, I was there for the 9-year pastorate of David P. Ver Nooy. He had served 2 churches in Brooklyn, 1 in Queens, 2 in Mount Vernon, and he came to us from Seaford, Long Island. And after leaving here, he served for 1 year in the Hudson Valley at Peekskill United Methodist Church. He and Ellie retired to Beacon and participated in the Beacon Church until his death at 83 in 2012. My recollections include his ministry, but also my experience at this church. My association with Church of the Village goes back to the 1970s when a Reverend Otto was pastor of Metropolitan-Duane. I had come to New York City, like so many people, from another town. I came with my husband and infant son. David, my husband, was a conscientious objector who had taken a job as national staff at the Episcopal Peace Fellowship, and their offices happened to be located in Holy Apostles, the Church of the Holy Apostles on 9th Avenue and 28th Street. So we lived behind the national office of the Peace Fellowship. So this lifelong Methodist began her New York experience as an Episcopalian. And I went there for 5 months or so before my Methodist roots brought me to Metropolitan-Duane, which was a mid-sized or smaller congregation. However, my time there was short-lived because I returned to Seattle for 4 years. And then again, when I came back to New York, I went to Holy Apostles for 6 months and then transferred my membership to Metropolitan-Duane, where I stayed a member until I went to seminary and became ordained. The congregation seemed a little smaller, maybe 75 in worship. And the pastor this time was Ed Egan, who had been there a few years. The members of the church included clergy and non-clergy staff of the General Board of Global Ministries. I grew up calling it 475. That was so exciting for me to go to church with executive staff like Randy Nugent and many, many more people. But it was equally exciting to go to church at Metropolitan-Duane because there was such a variety of members from the arts, theater, opera, a variety of members from other music professions, performance, and instrumental. And I remember one of the members was a part of the cast of Dreamgirls. Another was James Earl Jones, the father of Robert Earl Jones. He himself also an actor. Some members were from successful single ministries that had been held in the church years before, and they stayed on. But there were couples and singles, there were families and children, including my young son, who at 5 was an acolyte. If there were folks from the LGBTQI community, I have to admit it wasn't so clear at that time. I was aware of some individuals who were there, but you know how much of a button-down time it was, and things just were not so open. I knew the pastor was self-identified, and his partner, Russ, did not live in the parsonage. They didn't live in the parsonage together. I muffed that. Edit. Russ did attend some services, but he wasn't very active in the life of the church. I knew that the church had hosted and started the original Parents of Gay group. If I'm not wrong, it's now called PFLAG, an influential advocacy group that took the issue well beyond our doors. I can remember when I became the PPR chair near the end of Ed's tenure, I helped to transition David Ver Nooy into the parsonage next door at 56 7th Avenue when he and Ellie moved there with their teenage daughter, Crystal. She was in high school, and the other three children were out of the nest. Ellie was an accomplished social worker who wasn't active in the church, and she worshiped now and then. David was a good pastor, and frankly, you didn't know all of the things he accomplished because he certainly never talked about what he had done in the past. He quietly continued his commitment to social activism, which I only learned about after his death. In 1964, during the Civil Rights Movement, he and two other clergymen from the New York Conference took part in an effort to desegregate the Methodist Church in Jackson, Mississippi. It was David Ver Nooy, John Collins, and Bishop Herb Skeet. Interruption. You know the book, Segregation. Okay. David took biblical matters to heart. That's the fact. It was just a given for him that equal rights for all was a basic notion of our Christian faith. And the idea of racism and discrimination in the church simply wasn't acceptable. My sense of it is that throughout his ministry at other churches where he worked in racially diverse neighborhoods, he was always emphasizing inclusion and working quietly on civil rights and human dignity. David also came out of a long history with the Ecumenical Institute. It was one of his passions. It informed his methods in the local church. If you don't know, the Ecumenical Institute was a church renewal movement that was spawned in Chicago and grew out of the World Council of Churches. He believed deeply in ecumenics, the inclusion of all people in the household of God. So I remember one of the things that he used to do in his ministry was, instead of traditional Bible study, we would do film studies and watch movies that helped to explain biblical and theological aspects of our faith. While at Met-Duane, there were other expressions of his advocacy and inclusion. The church had become, before David came, the home of Metropolitan Community Church. Ironically, I was very familiar with the MCC because they had started at Holy Apostles. And like me, they came to the Methodist Church. For all of my active ministry and participation at Church of the Village, I want you to know that MCC was part of my regular Sunday activity. They were here from 5 p.m. to 9 p.m., and I was frequently the host, and I knew all of the leaders, the pastors, and the lay people alike. Now, our services were from 9 to noon, and in between, there was a fledgling Korean congregation. Maybe you've heard of Met Choreo. It was started by a pioneering United Methodist female pastor. David encouraged her ministry when there wasn't much else supporting her, and it was tough for Korean women to get a footing. Her husband, John, however, was a great spouse, and he was active in the life of their congregation. But that was another example of David's commitment to inclusion. Later, Met Choreo moved to Lexington Avenue, but I'm telling you, Church of the Village rocked from 9 to 9 every Sunday. Another example of David's advocacy and compassion was the effort to save a nursing home in the village. Now, my history may be a little rusty, but New York State tried to close the village nursing home after a fraud situation that was taking place there. And there was an entire community campaign to save it so that the seniors and others with health needs could find a place of care in the village. And David was part of that response. As you know, the HIV/AIDS crisis was on the rise in that time. And so I think those efforts merged. And David was part of that effort that resulted in what is now Village Care, a 40-year-old organization. He and some of the members were involved, including myself. HIV/AIDS was a whisper at that time. It was a huge concern. And so the merging of the senior concerns and HIV was crucial to the survival of the nursing home, which, as I say, became Village Health. By the way, one member of our church who was beloved and active in all regards, a school teacher, got sick, very sick with AIDS, and the congregation rallied around his care. And I credit David largely to the matter of education of the people in the congregation who were struggling with their fear. Those of us who were less fearful could care for him, provide meals and visit and so forth. But that was part of dealing with it in the case of one specific member. We had to face fear, but at the same time, we had to care for our dear friend Sam. And David led us through that time. I think another significant priority of David's time at Met-Duane, or Church of the Village, was cooperative ministry. If I take a step back in history, some of you may already know the long history of the churches that began to roll up from Lower Manhattan as New York City developed. And the churches combined and merged and so forth. I always love it that Metropolitan-Duane was named after the street in Lower Manhattan of the same drugstore name. And Metropolitan Temple was the other surviving name. I speculated that the investments that some of those churches had something to do with who got to retain the name. Because as long as I was a member of Metropolitan-Duane, we were very, very lucky to have two investment funds that came out of that early history of the church. But now that we were operating in the middle core, things began to change again, population-wise, membership-wise. And in the early 80s, I know Jeff is familiar with the exact years, when Paul Abel was at Washington Square, he and David Ver Nooy, along with two pastors from the Church of All Nations, Reverend Carol Cox of the English congregation, and a Spanish language pastor whose name I'm sorry I've forgotten. We held meetings, we held shared services. I remember Maundy Thursday and other Lenten services. We did a few mission projects together, and we spent a lot of time because David had a vision of cooperative ministry for these churches. Of course, it was before Washington Square was sold, but you know what happened. So this, I think, was an early phase of Church of the Village, and it reflected the tradition of adapting and realigning churches as we continue to minister to our community. By the way, there was a huge methadone maintenance clinic in the building. I can't remember which hospital ran it, but you understand that to have a busy church in the city involves a huge amount of administration and tenant relations to oversee. David often commented that he had never had a church with so much administrative management time spent on things like the methadone maintenance clinic and the other churches. But to your credit, this church started a counseling center. The history of the counseling center, which may or may not continue in some other form, is that a member with licensed credentials had transferred from an uptown Methodist church. We had a registered nurse who worked in our congregation as well, and together, David and they developed a community counseling center on the second floor. Here's another one. The custodian at the time was a neighborhood fellow, and so David encouraged the informal basketball program that grew up around the Friends, young adult men who came into the building to play basketball. It was just another way to make sure the church was open to its community. Another tenant was Country Dance, which used the building 2 times weekly, Tuesdays and Saturdays, but also sometimes Friday for special events. I spent a lot of time there hosting the building and loved the music. One of the most meaningful ministries, however, that happened for me at Metropolitan-Duane and under David's ministry was a crock-pot Bible study. He not only knew how to cook, he knew how to build fellowship and develop relationships with members of the community. So during the day when he was in the office, he would cook, and we all came after work to eat. He conducted a successful long-term Bible study. I think it was about 26 weeks on the Old Testament. This was both nourishing and fulfilling in every sense of the word, and it also turned out to be a key factor in my going to seminary. So in summary, I want to say that it was his gift to encourage people towards Christian vocation. I wasn't the only one he affirmed and supported at this or other churches. David Ver Nooy was my pastor and my teacher. Along the way to my ordination and even after, he served as a mentor. He was so generous with his time that he conducted retreats in 2 of my parish appointments. He was a good and faithful servant, a true and devoted disciple who made a difference. He was a pastor here for 9 years, and so he's a part of your history too. Thank you for letting me share.